A thin ribbon of highway stretched ahead of him, glowing beneath the headlights like a path he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to follow. He'd been on the road for hours, long enough for the world to shrink into the hum of the engine and the quiet ache behind his eyes. It was nearly midnight, and the dash clock kept blinking its judgment at him, each pulse a reminder of how late he was dragging himself back to a life that no longer felt like his. He rolled his shoulders, trying to work out the stiffness that had settled into him during those endless conference days. 3 full days of pretending he cared about sales numbers, shaking hands with people who only remembered him long enough to hand him their business cards, and sitting through banquet dinners that tasted like they'd been thawed minutes before being served. He'd smiled until the muscles in his jaw begged for mercy. Now, alone in the car, the smile felt like a mask he'd forgotten to take off. In the back seat, his travel bag slumped onto its side, defeated, like it understood exactly how he felt. His briefcase sat beside it, the latch still refusing to close properly no matter how gently or forcefully he coaxed it. He pictured the moment he'd walk through the front door and how Carol would greet him with that distant half-smile she'd perfected. Once upon a time, she looked at him like she could read every thought right out of his eyes. Now she looked past him, as if she were watching someone else standing just over his shoulder. He had called her from the last rest stop, hoping the sound of her voice might pull him home with a little more warmth. She picked up after a long pause, her words heavy with exhaustion. He told her he was nearly there, but she answered with a flat okay, the kind someone gives when they're already drifting away or when they don't know what else to say. They hung up quickly. He stayed behind in the bathroom for a while, staring at his reflection under the harsh fluorescent light. The man looking back at him seemed like a stranger wearing his clothes. He wondered when that transformation had happened, when he had stopped recognizing himself. Past exit 34, his phone lost its signal entirely. He kept checking it anyway, habit more than hope, scrolling through messages that didn't matter, reminders about groceries, repairs that needed doing, errands waiting for him at home. All the tiny pieces of a life that felt like it belonged to someone he was only pretending to be. He flicked on the radio, but all he got was static. The silence that followed was worse. It wasn't empty, it felt alive, pressing in around him. It made him notice things he usually ignored. The uneven sound of his breathing, the faint whistle in his nose he'd promised himself he'd get checked someday, the thudding of his heart that seemed louder in the quiet than it ever did during the day. Somewhere far away, in a dorm room filled with unwashed laundry and textbooks flipped open to chapters his son probably didn't read, David would be asleep. Gerald imagined him sprawled across his bed, one arm hanging off the side, still wearing the hoodie he lived in. He tried to remember the last time they'd had a conversation that felt genuine, one that wasn't just a checklist of weekly updates. A moment where he could hear his son's real voice instead of the polite, distant tone David used when he couldn't wait to get off the phone. The road ahead continued to unfurl into the dark, and he drove on, feeling the weight of every mile settling deeper into his bones. He tried to summon a moment, any moment, when he'd spoken to his son in a way that felt real, but all he could picture was that August morning at the airport. David's expression had been polite, detached, like he was already halfway into his new life. Even as they hugged goodbye, Gerald had felt as though his son's mind was already miles away. He blinked hard and refocused on the road. That was when he noticed it, something ahead of him that hadn't been there before. It didn't appear suddenly, it eased into existence, almost like a shadow taking shape. The highway had been empty just a breath ago. Now in the distance, 2 faint points glowed red, but they looked wrong, too soft, too muted, as if he were seeing them through a veil. Gerald lifted his foot gently off the accelerator. The gap between them neither shrank nor widened. And then the truth hit him with a cold, precise clarity. Those weren't tail lights at all. The car in front of him didn't have lights. What he was seeing was nothing more than his own headlights glancing off a dull piece of metal. A chill crept up his spine. His first instinct was simple: drunk driver. His second thought, someone clueless, maybe elderly, maybe exhausted, just making a mistake on a dark road. But the third thought came from someplace deeper and stranger, a feeling like walking through a doorway and suddenly forgetting what you went in to do. A flicker of disorientation that settled in his chest. He should flash his high beams. That was the normal thing to do, a common courtesy, a quick signal to say, "Hey, your lights are off." He'd done it for strangers his entire life. Most people responded with a grateful wave or a blink of their lights. Tiny proofs that even on lonely highways, people still looked out for each other. His fingers reached for the signal stalk, then froze. A memory hit him with the sour jolt of nausea. He couldn't place where he'd first heard the story. Somewhere casual, somewhere forgettable. Maybe the office. Maybe that neighborhood barbecue with too much smoke and too little food. No, it was Donnie Clark from accounting. Donnie with his love for spooky gossip and whispered warnings. Gerald could almost smell reheated noodles and burnt popcorn from the break room as he remembered Donnie leaning in conspiratorially. "They do it for gang initiations," Donnie had whispered. "They drive with no lights on, waiting for someone to flash them, and when someone does," he'd never finished the tale. Someone else had walked in, or the microwave beeped, or the moment dissolved into small talk. But Gerald remembered the way Donnie's voice dipped at the end, heavy with the suggestion of something awful. A ritual, a hunt, a crime waiting for a target. Gerald swallowed hard. He knew it was nonsense. Of course it was. One of those stories that traveled from email chains to social media posts, always claiming it happened to some friend of a friend. He'd heard a dozen flavors of the same myth over the years and never given it even a moment's belief. But the memory clung to him now, sticky and unwelcome. Up ahead, the dark car kept moving at the exact same speed, silent, unlit, and barely there, like a shape carved from the darkness itself. He tried to shake off the creeping unease. There was being paranoid, and then there was being practical. He wasn't a kid anymore. The world wasn't the safe, predictable place his parents once believed it to be. Everyone knew that now. Every news alert seemed designed to remind you that danger could bloom anywhere. Parking lots, grocery stores, quiet streets in the middle of the afternoon. Just a few weeks earlier, Carol had insisted they get a home security system. Not because anything had happened to them personally, but because Mrs. Wallace down the block had installed one. Then the Hendersons across the street followed, and before long, all of Sycamore Drive was buzzing with motion sensors and keypad codes, families shielding themselves from threats that no one had actually seen, but were certain were waiting. Gerald remembered watching the technician drill into their doorframe, feeling the vibration travel up his arm, thinking, is this who we are now? People who barricade ourselves before trouble even knocks. But he'd signed the check anyway, because that's what people did now. They prepared for shadows. He eased off the gas, letting more space grow between him and the dark shape ahead. But the unease didn't fade. If anything, the distance made it worse. It felt wrong to simply drive past. What if the person in that car really didn't know their lights were off? What if they were confused, or drifting off, or in trouble? He could practically hear his mother's voice echoing from some deep and dusty corner of memory. Her gentle insistence that you looked out for people, that you stepped up when something seemed off. But she had come from a different world. A world where neighbors wandered into each other's backyards without knocking and kids roamed until the street lamps flickered on. She passed away 6 years earlier, still believing people were, at their core, decent. Still believing that danger was the exception, not the rule. That world felt like a story now, something half imagined. Up ahead, the lightless car appeared to slow. Gerald glanced in the rearview mirror, nothing but darkness swallowing the road behind him. He checked ahead again, no one but the two of them, moving like ghosts through the wide, empty stretch of interstate. 3 lanes, miles of emptiness, and a silence so complete it made him aware of how small he was beneath the open sky. How insignificant any one person was in the face of the world's vastness. He could end this. Just accelerate, drift into the next lane, past the mysterious vehicle, and leave the whole unsettling encounter behind. In 40 minutes he'd be home. The house would be quiet. Carol would already be asleep. She always turned in early now, claiming even the soft glow of the TV kept her awake, though he'd long ago switched to headphones. He imagined slipping through the front door, brushing his teeth in the dim bathroom, and easing into bed without disturbing her. By morning, this strange, pointless tension on the highway would feel like nothing at all, less than a passing thought, less than a tiny ripple in an otherwise forgettable night. He knew he was being pulled in 2 directions. One part of him wanted to stay cautious, to keep his distance, to avoid becoming a headline in a story people whispered about. But another part, an older, quieter part, reminded him of the people who raised him, the values he'd once carried without question. You didn't just ignore someone who might need help. The thought tightened in his chest. What if that driver was someone's grandmother, too confused to notice the darkness around her? What if it was a teenager on their very first night drive, terrified and unaware? What if it was someone like his mother during those last fatting years, when familiar roads twisted into strange mazes, and she once drove miles in the wrong direction before realizing she no longer understood the world the way she used to? What if? What if? What if? Before he could talk himself out of it, Gerald lifted his hand and flashed his high beams, quick, polite bursts of white. Once, twice. Nothing. The dark car didn't respond at all. It didn't tap the brakes. It didn't drift. It didn't even twitch. It just glided forward unchanged, as though his signals were swallowed by the night. He tried again, 3 sharp flashes this time. Still nothing. A strange embarrassment prickled at him. He felt ridiculous, like he'd rehearsed a kindness to an audience that wasn't even looking. Maybe they simply hadn't noticed him. Maybe their mirror was tilted, or maybe they were too locked in on the road to see anything behind them. He opened his mouth to sigh when the car ahead shifted. Not slowing, not pulling over. Turning. Right there, in the middle of the interstate. The car swung across the dividing strip with a heavy bounce, pivoting cleanly until it faced him, head-on. The headlights remained dark until the moment the turn completed. Then, without warning, they blasted to life, flooding the highway with violent light. Gerald didn't think. His whole body reacted for him. He slammed the accelerator to the floor. The engine snarled and the car lunged forward. He veered into the left lane just as he shot past the spot where the stranger had crossed. His heart punched against his ribs, frantic and uneven. Instinct dragged his eyes to the rearview mirror. The other car had finished its turn. It settled into the northbound lanes, his lanes, and began to speed up, closing the distance, following him. The urban legend, The stupid, impossible story. The one he'd laughed off his entire life. It was unfolding behind him on a silent, empty highway. He forced himself to inhale to try and untangle the surge of panic. Think, Gerald, think. There had to be a reasonable explanation. There always was. Maybe the driver actually had missed their exit. Maybe they really were trying to catch up and thank him. Maybe. No. He replayed the details, the ones that mattered. They were already driving the same direction as he was. They had no reason to turn around. And the most important detail, the one that refused to be reasoned away. They had been driving without their lights, deliberately unseen, until the moment they turned to face him. The detail hit him like a punch, the one piece that locked everything into place. Lights off, waiting for a signal. Just like the whispered story people swore actually happened to a friend of a friend. He looked again. The car was closer now, 100 yards, maybe less, gaining with a steady, deliberate pull. Its headlights, now blindingly bright, flooded his rearview mirror until it became nothing but a sheet of blazing white. He couldn't make out the road behind him at all. Only the glare, only the presence. Gerald pushed the gas pedal deeper. 70. 75. The other car's speed rose with his, perfectly matched. It didn't lunge or swerve or behave like someone hurrying to pass. It just hung there, fixed in place, like it had locked onto him. His phone. He needed his phone. He reached toward the cup holder, fingers trembling as they brushed the dark rectangle. He pressed the screen. Nothing. Tried again. Nothing. The battery had finally surrendered somewhere along this endless black stretch. No reception anyway, he muttered, but it didn't soothe him. Not now. The realization felt like another door closing. He should have charged it at the rest stop, should have plugged it in before leaving. But he'd been too distracted, thinking about Carol's tired voice, the flat way she'd said, okay, like she hadn't cared whether he drove home or kept going forever. 80 miles an hour now. And still, the pursuing car clung to him, unwavering, its lights burning through the mirror like a spotlight trained on prey. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to men like him. He sold medical equipment. He paid his taxes on time. He had a son drowning in textbooks 3 states away and a wife who barely looked at him anymore. He wasn't special. He wasn't the kind of person people targeted. There was no reason for this. Except one. He had flashed his lights. He had done the one thing the legend warned against. And now he was trapped in the nightmare version of a story he'd always chalked up to nonsense. He forced himself to look at the glowing numbers on the dashboard. His exit, Sycamore Drive, was coming in 12 miles. He could almost see the sign in his mind, green and friendly, pointing toward home with the same confidence it always had. But he couldn't go there. He couldn't lead this thing, this person, into the quiet street where Carol slept, into the home they'd built for 19 years, into the place stamped with his name on every bill, every record, every document declaring, this is where Gerald Fisk lives. This is where to find him. 9 miles. 8. His hands tightened on the wheel. He pictured Carol waking to a knock, padding down the hallway half asleep, opening the door out of habit, because that was how they'd both been raised, to be polite, to help, to trust. All those lessons passed down from a gentler time could become the very thing that failed her. The house had a new security system, sure, but neither of them really knew how to use it yet. And locked doors didn't mean much if you invited danger inside with a smile. He felt a coldness settle into him, deeper than fear, heavier than dread. He couldn't go home. Not tonight. Not with whatever was behind him. Gerald jerked the wheel hard to the right without a second thought. The car behind him mirrored the movement instantly, sliding into the lane as if tethered to his every motion. He swerved left again. It followed, back and forth, left, right. Every shift, every evasive maneuver matched. He realized with a sinking, stomach-twisting certainty this wasn't an accident. They were playing, toying. The engine's low, powerful growl hinted at untapped speed, a predator holding back simply for sport. 6 miles, 5-2, a rest stop sign appeared in the distance. Gerald tried to reason with himself. There would be people there, he told himself. Truckers, travelers, witnesses. He could pull in, run inside, find help. Unless, he swallowed hard, the rest stop was deserted. Unless it was just him and whatever was following him in the dead of night. The exit came too fast. Gerald ripped the wheel right, taking the ramp far too quickly. Tires screamed in protest. Behind him, the other car executed the turn with precise, casual grace. The rest stop rose out of the darkness like a low, squat fortress under buzzing fluorescent lights. Gerald's heart sank. The parking lot was empty. Not a single car. Not a single light from the building's windows. A handwritten sign was taped to the door, slanted and fading, closed for renovation. The message was obvious enough. The pursuing car slid into the lot's entrance, blocking any hope of escape. Gerald circled desperately, scanning for another way out. A narrow service road appeared like a faint line carved into the shadows. Without hesitation, he gunned the accelerator, launching over a curb that his car's suspension wasn't built to handle. Branches scraped the sides with a shriek like fingernails on glass. The road was rough, unpaved, littered with weeds and broken asphalt. Behind him, the car followed perfectly, closing the distance so that he could almost see the outline of the driver's head in his mirror. Heart hammering, Gerald burst onto an unknown county route. No lights, no signs, just the darkness stretching ahead. Then, like a lifeline, a glow appeared. A gas station. Its sign blazed in the night, humming, 24 hours. A small beacon against the void. He slammed into the lot so fast he nearly clipped a pump. Heart hammering, legs burning, he threw the car into park and bolted toward the building. The door was locked. He yanked harder, rattling the glass, gasping for breath. Inside, a clerk looked up from behind the counter, eyebrows raised in annoyance, the flicker of fluorescent light revealing nothing but human indifference. "Please," Gerald's voice cracked as he rattled the handle again, desperation spilling into the empty lot. Gerald swallowed hard. His throat felt dry, as if he'd been running for miles. The idea of standing still for 20 more minutes, 20 minutes with that car sitting there like a predator pretending to rest, felt impossible. His mind drifted to his glove compartment, his home address, his name, his life neatly printed on documents any stranger could reach if they decided to break a window. If they wanted to follow him later, they'd have everything they needed. A shiver crawled up his spine. He stepped back from the service window, unable to stop his eyes from drifting again toward the mysterious car. Its engine still rumbled low, steady, patient. The kind of patience that only something confident or something wicked ever had. From his angle, he still couldn't see the driver. The windows were tinted too dark, the angle too sharp. It was like staring into a black mouth. Brittany's voice crackled through the speaker. "Sir, maybe just sit tight. Stay close to the window. The cameras will catch everything." Her words were meant to comfort. but they felt thin, fragile, like a spider web pretending to be a shield. Gerald took a shaky breath. "What if they leave?" he asked. "What if they wait for me down the road?" Brittany didn't answer. She didn't know. No one did. A sudden noise snapped his attention back, the click of a car door opening. But not his. The other car's driver's side door eased open slowly, deliberately, like someone savoring the moment. A shape stepped out. A tall figure, posture straight, movements calm. Too calm. Gerald felt the air around him tight. The figure didn't move toward him, didn't shout, didn't run. No, they simply stood there, one hand resting casually on the open door, head tilted, watching him. Gerald couldn't see the face. It was lost in shadow, swallowed by the gas station lights behind them. "Brittany," he whispered into the glass, "they're getting out." She looked up, her expression shifting, finally, to something like concern. "Okay, don't go anywhere," she said. "Just don't provoke them." Provoke them. Gerald took 2 steps backward, heart thundering so violently he could feel it in his fingertips. The figure finally moved, just a small step, but enough to show intention, enough to show that they were not confused, not lost, not harmless. They were here for him. Every dip in the pavement, every mailbox leaning too far toward the road. Yet tonight they felt unfamiliar, as though he were driving through a replica of his own life, something close enough to recognize, but wrong enough to unsettle. His headlights washed over the familiar lawns, but the darkness between the houses felt thicker than he remembered. Windows he'd passed thousands of times stared at him like dead eyes. And behind him the car followed. Not rushing, not lunging, just present, like a hunter walking behind wounded prey, knowing it didn't need to hurry. Gerald's hands shook on the wheel. He turned onto his street. The moment he did, he wished he hadn't. The act felt final, like closing a door behind himself. His house appeared at the end of the cul-de-sac, porch light glowing faintly, Carol's habit, always leaving it on for him. That light, usually warm and comforting, now looked pale and lonely. He slowed as he pulled into his driveway. The other car eased to a stop just before the mailbox. It didn't enter the driveway. It didn't block him. It simply sat there, engine idling, watching. He could go inside, wake Carol, call the police, barricade the doors. But what if they followed? What if they came to the house? What if he was leading something terrible straight into the life he had left? His hand hovered over the gear shift. He could still back out. He could still drive away. He could still choose a different ending than the one waiting at his front door. The porch light flickered. Just once. A tiny tremor of electricity or something else. Something watching through the glass. He felt a chill crawl from his spine to his fingertips. Carol might have gotten up. She might have walked by the switch. She might be right there behind the window, wondering why he hadn't come inside yet. Gerald opened the car door. The night air hit him instantly, sharp, cold, unnatural. It felt colder than the highway, colder than the gas station, colder than it should be in late spring. He stepped out. The other car's engine settled into a slow, deep rumble. Not revving, not threatening, just a reminder we're here. Gerald forced himself to stand tall, forced himself to breathe, forced himself to pretend he wasn't unraveling. He took a step toward his house, then another. Behind him, the car door clicked open. Softly, deliberately, the same way you might open the door for someone you've been waiting a very long time to meet. Gerald froze. A voice, quiet, distant, almost gentle, carried across the driveway. Gerald. His legs nearly buckled. No one outside this street knew his name. No one on that highway knew who he was. No one chasing a stranger should have known who he was. But the voice did. And the voice had been waiting. "Come here," it said. Gerald spoke so quickly he could barely hear himself, the sentences tumbling over each other as though they were trying to escape his mouth faster than his thoughts could form them. Carol stood frozen on the stairs, one hand gripping the banister, her expression somewhere between fear and disbelief. When he finally stopped, the house seemed too quiet. No engine outside, no footsteps, no shadows passing the window, just the soft hum of the refrigerator and the faint tick of the thermostat. "Gerald," Carol said carefully, "are you sure? Maybe you misunderstood. Maybe they were just." "I'm sure." His voice cracked on the word, sharper than he meant. "I'm telling you, they were following me. They turned around in the middle of the highway. They chased me off the road. They were at the gas station." "But where are they now?" The question hung in the air like a draft. Gerald swallowed hard. "I don't know, they were right behind me, and then they were." Carol stepped down a few stairs, her eyes softening. "Maybe you should sit. You look." A thump from somewhere outside cut her off. Both of them froze. Gerald turned toward the front window, dread leaking into his limbs like cold water. The security system's green light glowed steady, almost mocking. Another sound, not loud, faint, almost delicate, like something brushing against siding or fingertips along glass. Carol whispered, "Gerald." He held up a hand, quieting her. He strained to listen, every muscle stiff. A memory stabbed through him. Those headlights exploding to life, that slow U-turn, that impossible way they'd matched every move he made. He moved toward the window, each step careful, feeling the old floorboards shift under him. He pulled the curtain back a fraction of an inch. The street was empty. Utterly, impossibly empty. The same quiet houses, the same trimmed hedges, the same stillness. But the quiet wasn't comforting. It felt wrong again, wrong in a way that made his skin prickle. It was like the whole world was holding its breath. He let the curtain fall. "See," Carol said softly behind him, "there's nothing." He didn't answer. Something in him knew with the same dark certainty he'd felt behind the wheel, that whatever had followed him hadn't vanished. It was waiting. "Carol," he said without turning, "we need to call the police." "That's what I was going to suggest." He went to the phone on the kitchen wall, the old landline they barely used but never bothered to disconnect. His hand trembled as he picked it up. No dial tone. Just dead silence. He stared at the receiver, a slow chill creeping through him. The line had worked that morning. Carol had talked to their son that afternoon. The service had been fine. "Carol," he said quietly, "the phone isn't working." Before she could reply, the security system beeped. One sharp chirp. Then another. Gerald's heart lurched. The panel flashed a message he had never seen before. Back door open. Carol drew in a tiny breath, her fingers flying to her mouth. Gerald stared at the screen, unable to move. He had locked every door. He remembered locking every door. But something else had unlocked one. "Carol," he whispered, voice barely carrying, "go upstairs." "Gerald." "Go now." The house was no longer silent. Somewhere near the back of the kitchen, just beyond the doorway, a floorboard shifted. Slow, heavy, Deliberate. Someone was inside. Gerald leaned closer to the glass. The man on the lawn wasn't just crying. He was collapsing into himself, palms pressed against his face like he was trying to hold it together and failing. His whole body shook with each broken, ragged sob. It was the kind of crying you only hear when something has gone terribly, irreversibly wrong. And then Gerald realized what was missing. The man's car, dark blue familiar, always parked neatly in that driveway, was sitting with its driver's door slightly open. No headlights, no interior light, no engine running. It looked exactly the way Gerald's own car had looked 15 minutes earlier. Silent, waiting, innocent. But the man wasn't looking at the car. He wasn't even looking at his house. His eyes were fixed straight ahead toward the street, toward something Gerald couldn't see. Gerald felt the hairs rise on his arms. "Gerald," Carol whispered from behind him. "What is it? What do you see?" He didn't answer immediately. His mouth had gone dry. He forced his eyes to scan the darkness, moving slowly from mailbox to mailbox, hedge to hedge, looking for movement, for another pair of headlights, for anything. Nothing. Only the man sobbing into the night. "Gerald," Carol repeated, quieter now, unsettled by the way he wasn't speaking. He swallowed. It's Tom." "Tom who?" "I don't know his last name," Gerald admitted quietly. "The man 3 houses down. The one with the daughter and the big dog." Gerald shook his head. "No, that's the Hendersons." "Oh," a pause. "Then who is he?" "I don't know." The words tasted bitter. "I never learned." Carol moved closer, her breath warm against his shoulder as she looked over his arm toward the window. She spotted the man immediately. "Oh my God, is he hurt?" "I don't think so." Gerald's voice was barely above a whisper. "He's just crying." "Why?" "I don't know." But the question rung painfully inside him, because he did know the look of someone whose night had turned inside out. Someone who had seen something they couldn't explain. Someone who had run or driven or begged for help and still come home feeling hunted. Someone whose story sounded unbelievable. Someone whose spouse or clerk or friend might say, "Maybe you imagined it." Someone who might have flashed their lights at the wrong car. Gerald felt himself growing colder as the possibility clicked into place. What if the crying man had done the same thing? What if he too had been followed? What if Gerald wasn't the only one playing out the urban legend tonight? And then, as Gerald watched, something happened that made his throat tight. The man on the lawn suddenly stopped crying. He froze. He sat up straighter, as if listening. Slowly, painfully slowly, he turned his head toward his own driveway, toward his car. Not toward the house. Not toward the street. Toward the dark, silent car. As though he'd heard something inside it. As though something had called his name. Gerald's breath caught. "Carol," he whispered tightly, "step back from the window, now." "Why?" she asked, but her voice trembled. He didn't answer, because the man on the lawn had placed both hands on the ground and was rising to his feet. He wasn't looking around anymore. He was looking directly at the open driver's side door of his own car, as though something or someone was waiting inside, had made him capable of seeing danger where there was only human pain. He sank onto the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, hands covering his face. For the first time since the chase, or what he thought had been a chase, Gerald felt the full weight of shame settle into his chest. Not the quick, sharp shame of embarrassment, but the deeper kind. The kind that comes when a person looks at themselves honestly and doesn't like what they find. Behind him, Carol stood silently. She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't remind him how irrational he'd sounded. Her voice, when it came, was soft, steady. The voice of someone who understood that a man unraveling doesn't need correction. He needs a place to land. "What matters now," she said gently, "is that you're safe." But Gerald didn't feel safe. Not because of a threat outside, but because of what he'd discovered inside himself. He thought of Mr. Ashton's broken sobs, the raw grief echoing across the lawn, the older woman holding him upright, the open car door, the pale face of Mrs. Ashton days earlier. Life had been happening all around him, real life, hard life, and he'd been too wrapped in his own isolation to notice, too accustomed to keeping to himself, letting the world happen at arm's length, too used to assuming the worst. What terrified him most wasn't the dark road, or the headlights, or the imagined killers. It was how quickly he'd believed the lie his fear whispered. How easily he had turned an ordinary night into a nightmare, a neighbor into an enemy, a coincidence into a conspiracy. And how, in doing so, he had missed the real tragedy unfolding 3 houses down. He lowered his hands and looked at Carol. Her face was lined with concern, but there was something else there too, something sad and old, as if she had seen this fracture in him before, just never so clearly. "I don't know what's happening to me," he said quietly. Carol sat beside him. "You've been alone too much. On the road in your thoughts, it can twist things, it happens." He nodded, not trusting himself to speak. For a long while they sat in silence, the house still around them, the night air humming faintly through the walls. Somewhere down the street, a man mourned the worst moment of his life. And here, inside his own home, Gerald faced the quiet truth that fear, left to grow in the dark, can make a man lose himself. He wasn't being hunted tonight, but he had been lost. And now he had to find his way back. The thought struck him like a blow. How far would he have gone tonight? If fear had nudged him just a little harder, would he have sped through red lights, swerved into another car, put some innocent person in the hospital just because he thought danger was closing in? And if the police had intercepted both vehicles, Gerald wild-eyed and incoherent, the other driver baffled and shaken, how would anyone have untangled the truth from the chaos he had created in his own head? He imagined coming home to find Carol hurt, frightened, all because he'd warned her to prepare for something that never existed. He imagined Mr. Ashton, grief blinding his judgment, caught in some terrible accident because Gerald had blasted him in the face with high beams at exactly the worst moment. Each possibility stacked on top of the next like falling bricks. What if, what if, what if? Carol's voice drifted toward him, soft and distant, as though she were calling from another room entirely. "Gerald, are you okay?" He was, and deep down, he feared he might never be again. Because tonight had peeled back a layer of himself he hadn't known existed. He had seen how easily his imagination could warp the everyday into something sinister, how quickly panic could twist a stranger into a threat, a coincidence into a conspiracy. He'd always believed the frightening part of life was what other people might do to you. But now he understood the darker truth. The most terrifying stories are the ones your own mind tells when it's drowning in fear. Outside, Mr. Ashton was still on his knees in the grass, shoulders shaking. Carol moved away from the window, murmuring something about making tea, about calling someone in the morning, about settling his nerves. But Gerald barely registered any of it. He stood alone in the shadowed living room, eyes fixed on the narrow opening in the curtain. A part of him felt he should go out there, to offer sympathy, to say something. But how could he step onto that lawn knowing he'd spent the last hour imagining this man as a hunter following him through the night? How could he offer condolences when, in his own frightened mind, he had turned their personal tragedy into the plot of his private nightmare? Tomorrow he would learn the truth. Neighbors would share the news in hushed voices. Mrs. Ashton had passed away. Maybe a failing heart, maybe a long illness. One of the countless quiet ways life slips out from under people. Tomorrow he would bring flowers with Carol, stand at their doorstep, and speak the empty, polite sentences people recite when there's nothing meaningful to say. But tonight he remained rooted in place, watching a man break down under the weight of real grief, while Gerald grappled with a horror of his own making. The fear he felt wasn't of monsters lurking outside his home. It was the realization of how quickly his mind had built a monster out of nothing at all. And that, he realized with a cold tremor, was the most unsettling truth of all. He understood now, with a quiet horror settling deep in his chest. He had been the shadow he was running from. He had been the whisper in the dark, the figure lurking just out of sight. He had been his own monster. Carol's voice floated down the hallway, gentle, patient, urging him to come to bed. "You need rest, Gerald. Try to sleep." But the idea of sleep felt impossible. His mind was too loud, too awake, too heavy with all the realizations crashing through him. Because this wasn't the first time he'd let fear guide his eyes. Not the first time he'd let a passing moment bend into something sinister. Tonight simply exposed what had been happening for years, quietly, silently, unnoticed. He thought about every moment he'd misread, every stranger he'd judged without reason, every scenario where he'd chosen suspicion over human decency. The alarm system, he insisted on upgrading again and again. The way he'd crossed the road when someone unfamiliar walked toward him. How he'd warned David never to trust anyone, planting seeds of fear in a child who hadn't yet learned the world's gentler parts. The slow retreat from neighbors, from conversations, from the richness of community, all replaced by the comfort of locked doors and worst-case scenarios. How much of his life had he spent protecting himself from ghosts he had invented? Outside, the woman who had come to comfort Mr. Ashton was helping him stand. Together, they made their way back toward the house. In a moment, the yard would be empty, quiet, utterly normal, like the night hadn't cracked something open inside Gerald. But something had cracked. He had chased an illusion through the streets, believing wholeheartedly in a danger that had never existed. His pulse had raced, his thoughts had spiraled, his instincts had screamed, and all of it had been a reaction to shadows cast by his own mind. And the part that chilled him most, the part that would keep his eyes wide open long after the house went dark, was the simple truth that this wasn't a one-time thing. It could happen again. It would happen again. Because once fear is allowed a voice, it doesn't quiet down. Once imagination learns how to twist the ordinary into a warning, it doesn't forget how. The stories you invent become louder than the world outside your window. The unlit car had never been the threat. The grieving man behind the wheel had never been the villain. The danger had begun the moment Gerald dug up an old rumor, an urban tale designed to frighten, and decided to take it as truth. That was the moment he crossed a threshold into a world where logic lost its footing, where judgment dissolved, where the everyday became distorted into something dark. He had driven himself home, but something else had slipped in beside him. Something born from the space between reality and fear. Something that lived in the cracks of his imagination, patient and hungry. And as he stared out into the now quiet street, Gerald knew one thing with absolute certainty. The world hadn't been haunting him tonight. He had been haunting himself. Whatever he had awakened tonight didn't stay out on the road. It had followed him home, quiet, invisible, and terribly familiar. It settled into the walls, the air, the corners of the room like it had always belonged here. Because it hadn't come from headlights or strangers or cars with their lights off. It had come from him. The idea struck him with a cold clarity. The human mind is the most talented liar you will ever meet. It knows exactly which fears to whisper, which memories to twist, which shadows to stretch until they look like threats. And his mind had done all of it effortlessly. Outside, the street had gone still again. The lawns were empty, the windows dark, the night peaceful in a way that almost felt cruel. Carol had already gone upstairs, her footsteps fading into the kind of silence a person only notices after something breaks inside them. Gerald didn't move. He stood in the middle of his quiet living room, surrounded by the familiar shapes of his life, family pictures, the old sofa, the soft hum of the refrigerator, and felt like he was seeing everything through a new, unsettling lens. This house had always felt safe. This neighborhood had always felt predictable. But now he understood something he had been blind to for years. The real horror was never outside. It never needed to lurk in the shadows or hide behind a steering wheel. It lived inside the stories people tell themselves. Inside the cracks where fear collects. Inside the space where imagination and panic quietly shake hands. And tonight, all it took was one misunderstanding, one ordinary moment twisted by the wrong thought, for that hidden part of him to step forward and take control. He realized now that it had been waiting. Patient, unnoticed, waiting for the perfect fear, waiting for the perfect excuse, waiting for him to believe in it. Gerald finally let out a breath he didn't remember holding, but it didn't bring relief. If anything, it made the room feel heavier. This was the truth he would carry for the rest of his life. The darkness outside the window had never been the threat. The danger had lived inside him all along. Quietly watching, quietly waiting, for the moment he finally listened. Story 2, she's still trying to please him. Diane Fletcher had never imagined herself living alone again. Yet here she was, keys in hand, staring up at a narrow, weathered apartment building tucked into the Colorado skyline. 6 months of vacancy, the landlord had said with a careful smile, and Diane could almost believe that explained the lingering stillness inside. It wasn't unpleasant, not exactly. It was more like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting. The building leaned into the street with the kind of intimacy only old neighbors can manage, Victorian facades pressed together like women sharing secrets across fences. Paint had peeled, gingerbread trim dulled by decades of sun, rain, and time. And Diane, who had spent the last few months crammed into her sister's guest room with all its pointed questions and quiet judgment about dating apps, welcomed the solitude. Quiet sounded like salvation. The apartment was modest. Living room, bedroom, kitchen barely wider than her outstretched arms, and a bathroom tiled with small hexagons that probably gleamed white when the building opened in the 1920s. Dust motes floated in the late afternoon light, trapped like tiny insects in amber, and Diane watched them for a moment, letting herself breathe. She had signed the lease the same day. The landlord's dining table, mismatched teacups, polite conversation. It all felt like an initiation she could quietly step into. Very safe, very friendly, the landlord had said, but Diane had noticed the shadow behind the words, the subtle pause before he added, though of course, one does hear things. Diane had asked what kind of things, and the landlord's wife had merely smiled and poured more tea. October moved quickly. Boxes stacked in corners, narrow stairs creaking beneath her sister's complaints about heavy lifting, her advice disguised as concern about health, gyms, self-care. Diane ignored it all. She had long learned that silence could be sharper than words. And so she settled into the apartment, into the quiet, into the space that smelled like forgotten months and secrets tucked behind walls. For the first time in years, Diane felt like she could exist without someone else's gaze measuring her worth, without someone else defining what it meant to be enough. Yet, even in the quiet, there was a subtle tension, a feeling that the apartment remembered the people who had lived there before, a faint echo of footsteps in the hallway when no one passed, shadows that lingered too long by the kitchen doorway. Diane told herself it was nothing, just the building settling, just the imagination of someone unused to being alone. But deep down, she knew she hadn't just moved into a new apartment. She had moved into a space where she would have to confront what it meant to please no one but herself, and that perhaps was the hardest thing of all. After her sister had gone, Diane sank into the quiet of her new apartment, letting it settle around her like warm water. This was the solitude she had craved, her own air, her own space, evenings entirely her own. No whispered judgments over breakfast, no passive reminders of all the ways she wasn't measuring up. She unpacked until shadows pooled across the floor and then, with no furniture to sit on, ordered pizza and ate it on the bare floor. The crust was bland, the cheese lukewarm, but the silence, oh, the silence was perfect. That night, for the first time in months, she slept without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing on her chest. Then came the rose. It was the third evening. Diane returned from work, keys jingling, coat slung over her shoulder, and froze in the doorway. There, lying across her pillow, was a single red rose. Stem perfectly trimmed, no thorns, impossibly vivid against the pale sheets. She glanced at the windows. Locked. Door, locked too. She had checked both this morning, as she always did, a habit honed from years of city living. Heart pounding, Diane swept the apartment, scanning for signs of intrusion. Everything was exactly as she had left it. Coffee cup in the sink, book on the armchair, shoes neatly by the door. Nothing was disturbed, nothing missing, except the rose resting innocuously on her pillow like a signal. She stepped closer, picked it up with trembling fingers, and the air shifted. A weight pressed on her chest, a grief that wasn't hers but felt like it might be. It sank into her bones, an old sorrow that tasted of both resignation and fear. Diane nearly dropped to her knees. She let the rose slip from her hands, and just like that, the sensation lifted. Her breath came in shallow bursts as she studied the flower on the pillow, its red almost burning in the dim light. Slowly, cautiously, she picked it up again, holding only the very tip of the stem. This time, nothing came. No weight, no sorrow, no invisible hands pressing her down. Diane filled a kitchen glass with water, set the rose inside, and sat at the small table, staring at it as if it might speak. Logic fought against unease. Perhaps the landlord had entered to check something, leaving it as a welcome gift. But that didn't feel right. He was old, his hands steady and practical, and his wife had seemed kindly enough when she'd served them tea. This wasn't them. Something in the rose felt alive in a way that should have been impossible. And as Diane traced the petals with her fingertips, she realized she wasn't just holding a flower. She was holding a question, a warning, a whisper from somewhere beyond understanding, and she didn't yet know what it meant. Diane stared at the rose again, the impossible crimson bloom in its tiny glass. It made no sense. The apartment had been empty for half a year. No landlord wandering in. No careless previous tenant. And yet here it was, fresh, perfect, untouched by time. She ran her fingers along the window latches, double-checked the locks on the door. Everything was secure. Even peering under the bed and into closets revealed only the familiar dust motes dancing in the golden afternoon light. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. Nothing was there except her and the flower, and the growing shadow that pressed against the edges of the room. That night she ordered Thai food and sat at the tiny table, chopsticks in hand, eyes darting to the rose as though it might speak. Beautiful, exquisite, a symbol of something she wasn't sure she remembered how to feel anymore. Married once briefly to a man whose charm had dissolved into absence, she barely recognized the person she had been then. The rose, she realized, had no history of pain, no memory of disappointment. It was pure. Yet that purity unsettled her more than anything else in the apartment. Days turned into weeks. The rose did not wither. Not a petal browned, not a leaf drooped. If anything, it seemed more alive, more vibrant, as if time bent around it. On the fourth week, unable to bear the silent accusation any longer, Diane threw it away, glass, water, stem, all of it, into the dumpster behind the building. That evening she returned to find it on the kitchen counter again. Perfect, unyielding, crimson, crystalline, impossible. She did not touch it. She did not acknowledge it. She learned to move around it, to let it sit like a mute sentinel, constant and unblinking. Then came Friday. Diane had spent the day wrestling with a client who couldn't grasp that design required more than making things pop. Her patience was exhausted. She dropped her bag at the door, sank onto the couch, intending to scroll through her phone until her eyes screamed for mercy, then go to bed. The television flicked on. The sound startled her so violently that her heartbeat echoed in her ears. Blue-white light flooded the dim apartment. On the screen, ready and waiting, was the Philadelphia story, her old comfort, the film that reminded her that once, life had glamour, wit, and the effortless charm of someone unflinchingly perfect. Diane froze. No remote had moved. No timer had been set. And yet there it was, playing as though someone or something knew she needed it tonight. Her eyes flicked to the rose, gleaming in its glass, and for the first time the apartment didn't feel empty. It felt watched. It felt alive. She hadn't queued this film. She hadn't even signed into her streaming apps yet. Part of her had been avoiding it, because logging in, setting everything up, syncing accounts, it all meant accepting that she lived here now, that this silent apartment was home, and that she was doing it alone. Diane rose slowly from the couch and approached the television. The remote lay exactly where she had left it that morning, untouched. She clicked the power off, waited, turned it back on. The menu didn't change. The Philadelphia story still hovered there, glowing with patient insistence. "Hello," she whispered to the empty room, then winced at how absurd it sounded. Only the refrigerator hummed in response. With nothing else to do, and a strange heaviness settling over her, she hit play. She watched the familiar banter, the elegance, the illusions of old Hollywood charm. Katharine Hepburn effortless as ever, Grant smug and charming in equal measure, Jimmy Stewart stumbling with theatrical drunkenness. For a couple of hours, the apartment felt almost normal. But when the credits faded and the screen went black, Diane didn't move. The silence pressed on her like a physical weight. Something was wrong here, had been wrong since the rose. Eventually, she forced herself to stand and walk to the bedroom, and froze in the doorway. There on her pillow rested another rose, red, perfect, and this time impossible. She had thrown it away twice. She had left it in the kitchen. She had refused to touch it, yet now it lay on the place where her head should rest. She didn't dare bring it back to the kitchen, didn't dare touch it at all. Instead, she retreated to the couch and spent the night there, sleepless beneath the glow of streetlights creeping through the blinds. In the morning, when she finally gathered the courage to check the bedroom, the rose was gone. All that remained was a single petal, pressed delicately into the pillowcase as though marking a page she was meant to return to. After that, the television incidents multiplied. She'd come home from work to find it already on. A cooking show sizzling through recipes she'd never watch, a home renovation marathon, even a bizarre documentary about Victorian morning rituals that left the whole apartment feeling colder. Whenever she turned it off, the screen would blink back to life minutes later. One night it woke her at exactly 2:00 a.m. The glow seeped through the crack beneath her bedroom door like a blade of light. Groggy, she pushed herself up and shuffled toward the living room. The TV was on, but this time it wasn't playing a show, or a movie, or anything she recognized. It was displaying a live feed. Her living room, her furniture, her walls. The camera angle came from high in the corner, near the ceiling, an angle only a mounted camera could produce. And on the screen, she saw herself, standing in the bedroom doorway, watching the television, watching herself. Her breath shuddered out of her. She stepped back, terrified. The image stepped back. She raised her hand. The image raised its hand. It mirrored her perfectly, like a delayed reflection in a nightmare. Heart pounding, she lunged forward, yanked the plug out of the wall, and killed the screen. The apartment plunged into thick silence, and for a moment she stood there, frozen, waiting for something else to betray life where there shouldn't be any. That's when she heard it. Footsteps, soft, slow, and deliberate, coming from directly above her, from Lawrence's apartment. Back and forth, packing. At 2 a.m, Lawrence, who always complained about needing his 8 hours. Lawrence, who reminded her constantly about his early work schedule. He should be asleep. He always slept early. But something was moving overhead. With a tight knot forming in her stomach, Diane turned toward her bedroom, drawn by some instinct she couldn't explain. Fear, curiosity, or maybe the awful need to confirm what she hoped wasn't true. Because the footsteps had stopped, directly above her bed. Someone is thinking about me. Someone noticed me. Someone cares. The thought should have brought warmth, reassurance. Instead, it lodged in her chest like a stone, heavy and uneasy. The petals were impossibly red, unnaturally vibrant against the muted fabric of her pillow. Her fingers lingered on the stem, hesitant, as if touching it too firmly might shatter reality itself. For days, the rose remained. She didn't move it, didn't bring it to water, didn't mention it to anyone. She told herself it was a gift, a small gesture from someone who admired her. But every night, when the apartment grew quiet and the shadows stretched along the walls, A chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the Colorado autumn air. Then came the footsteps. Soft at first, a faint patter above her ceiling, brushing against her nerves like a ghostly touch. She froze mid-step while preparing dinner, listening. And as if mocking her hesitation, the steps followed her, perfectly mirroring her movements across the apartment. Left, right, pause, stop. Each shift of her weight matched exactly by the heavy tread above. Diane tried to laugh it off at first, telling herself it was Lawrence, moving about casually, unaware. But by the third night, the rhythm had become unmistakable. It wasn't random. It didn't wander. It wasn't humanly accidental. It waited for her to move, for her to react, and then it moved the same. By midnight on the fourth night, Diane no longer left the bedroom once the lights were out. She watched the ceiling, counting the minutes between steps, her heart thudding in time with the phantom rhythm overhead. Sleep felt impossible, her body taut and restless, every nerve alert to the faintest sound. And still, the rose sat on her pillow, impossible and vivid, a quiet reminder that someone or something was watching, anticipating, synchronizing. It wasn't just a gift anymore, it was a warning. When she finally dared to peek outside her window onto the quiet courtyard below, everything appeared normal. No movement, no shadows, no hint of the pattern that haunted her floors. But she knew the truth. The apartment above was not empty. It had never been empty. And Lawrence, with his casual smile and effortless charm, held a presence that Diane had yet to fully understand. A presence that would not let her forget that he, and the rose and the footsteps were all connected, waiting for her to slip up, to move, to notice, to fear. And Diane, who had thought moving into her own space meant freedom, realized that some things followed you no matter where you went. Some presences didn't respect doors, didn't respect locks, didn't care about distance. They only respected awareness. And tonight she was fully aware. Diane set the rose in a glass of water and for the first time in years felt a flicker of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long while. Luck. Lawrence had a way of appearing just when she needed him. When her groceries proved too heavy, he was there to help. When a day at work left her drained, he popped up in the lobby and suggested dinner. Casual, no pressure. She said yes because, well, why not? On a bitter November morning when her car refused to start, he walked past, smiled, and offered a ride. The interior of his car smelled like polished leather, the radio softly playing NPR. "I feel like I keep running into you," she laughed. "Small building," he said with a grin. Their lives began to intertwine with an ease that felt almost faded. Dinner once a week became twice a week, then a standing ritual. After the fifth date, he kissed her good night, gentle, deliberate. And when she returned to her apartment, there was no rose on her pillow. She didn't care. She didn't need one. She had something better. The roses stopped appearing entirely. Diane even noticed, and a quiet satisfaction settled over her, as if she had passed some unseen test. She had started thinking of the first roses as a kind of ghost, a lonely spirit guiding her toward happiness. Its work was done. It could rest. It was a story she chose to believe. Lawrence became a constant presence in her life. He cooked with her, brought wine, showed her how to sear a steak just right. He fixed her dripping faucet and mentioned casually that his lease would be up in February. Diane almost said something, could always, but stopped. The thought felt too early, too forward. Could always what? He asked, eyes steady and blue. Nothing, never mind, she murmured. You're sweet when you're nervous, he said, kissing her forehead. In December, over brunch, Diane told her sister about him. Her sister listened, sharpening her fork against pancakes with surgical precision, and asked, "And you met him how?" "Dropped my groceries," Diane said, bristling slightly. How convenient, her sister remarked. Lucky, Diane corrected herself defensively. Her sister said nothing more, shifting the conversation to Christmas plans. Diane returned home that afternoon to find Lawrence waiting in the lobby. This time he carried flowers, not roses, but tulips, yellow and bright. They drove together to dinner at a place where the bread was warm and the waiters knew her name. And for Diane, the world felt lighter, ordinary worries fading, replaced by the sense that maybe, just maybe, she had been guided to something real all along. Stepped forward, trying the knob herself. It turned. The door opened. She exhaled, a small laugh of relief escaping her. Lawrence stepped back, smiling faintly, but the warmth in his eyes had shifted subtly. It wasn't overt, not yet, but the shadow behind it was there. Over the next weeks, the tiny controls he had begun to assert expanded, almost imperceptibly. Which clothes she wore, which friends she saw, which routes she took home. Nothing harsh, nothing violent, just suggestions, concerned observations, questions that implied she might be wrong, that maybe she hadn't thought things through. Diane rationalized each one. He cares, she told herself. That's all. She found herself second-guessing. Before sending a text, she paused. Before choosing an outfit, she considered his probable opinion. She apologized constantly, apologized for what she hadn't done, for small missteps, for being late, for not texting immediately. I'm not angry, he would say softly. I'm just disappointed. And the weight of that disappointment settled over her, heavier than anger could ever have been. The first true fracture came in January. Diane had lunch with a male colleague. Nothing untoward, purely professional. Yet when she returned, Lawrence was waiting, his presence quiet but tense, like a shadow folded into her apartment. Who is he? He asked. Diane's heart sank. Just someone from work. We got Thai food, that's all. You didn't text me, he said, a controlled edge beneath the words. You don't think. You never think about how it makes me feel when you disappear for hours. The conversation spiraled, loops of accusation and defense, Diane repeating herself, justifying harmless choices she had no reason to defend. Exhausted, she finally said, "Please just go. I need space." He stared at her for a long moment, and in that pause she saw it. The cold assessment, the subtle calculation behind his calm exterior. Fine, he said, voice smooth. If that's what you want. He moved to leave. Diane followed, her hand already on the doorknob, desperate for the familiar relief of privacy. But the door didn't budge. She pushed, pulled. Nothing. It refused to open. Must be stuck, Lawrence said, the faintest note of satisfaction in his tone. Diane's stomach tightened. Something had shifted. She realized too late that the small adjustments, the subtle controls, were now solidifying into barriers. And while the locks were real, the real confinement was something far deeper, something that had quietly wormed its way into her life and now held her there. She stood there staring at the rainbow-striped closet and felt her throat close, because someone had done it, and that someone wasn't supposed to be in her home without her. But every time she tried to hold on to that certainty, it slipped. Maybe she had reorganized the closet. Maybe she'd washed the mug. Maybe she'd forgotten. Stress does strange things. Love does too. And fear can dissolve the edges of reality until everything feels soft, unstable, untrustworthy. The worst part wasn't the rearranged objects. It was the way the apartment felt when she walked in now. Like she wasn't coming home, but entering a space where someone had just been. The faintest shift in the air. A chair angled differently. A pillow indented. The scent of someone's cologne, so faint she might have imagined it. She kept telling herself she was being ridiculous. Lawrence had a key. Lawrence was tidy. Lawrence liked things a certain way. Many men did. Many men adjusted things without thinking. And yet, the roses had stopped the moment he came into her life. The televisions had stopped. The footsteps had stopped. Everything strange had gone quiet. Too quiet. One evening, after a long day at work, Diane walked into the bathroom, turned on the light, and froze. Her reflection stared back with wide, sleepless eyes. But what made her stomach turn was the mirror itself. Someone had cleaned it, perfectly. No streak, no smear, no trace of the toothpaste splatter she'd left that morning. In the corner of the mirror, almost invisible unless you leaned close, was a single fingerprint, not hers. She placed her thumb beside it, smaller, narrower, a man. Her breath caught. She backed away from the mirror as though it might reach out and grab her. The apartment felt occupied. When she stepped into the hallway, her phone buzzed in her pocket. "Lawrence, miss you." "Lawrence, almost home." A chill slipped down her spine. He didn't live here, he lived upstairs. At least he used to. She typed back with trembling hands. "Diane, okay." She didn't know why she wrote it. She didn't know why she kept agreeing, kept opening the door, kept letting him in. It felt like something inside her, some ability to resist, was dimming, like a lamp flickering lower and lower. When he arrived, he kissed her forehead as if nothing in the world was wrong, as if her door had never stuck shut, as if her belongings hadn't moved, as if she weren't coming apart inside. "You look tired," he said gently, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "You should rest. I'll take care of everything." Diane felt the familiar pull in her chest, the same soft, smothering pressure she had felt the first time she touched the rose. Grief, resignation, terror wrapped in tenderness. "Lawrence," she whispered, unsure what she'd even meant to say. He smiled, a small, warm, devastating smile. "You don't have to worry anymore," he said. "I'll make sure nothing ever hurts you again." He said it with such certainty, such quiet conviction, that Diane felt her pulse stutter. Because in that moment, she finally understood. Nothing had been happening to her apartment. Everything had been happening for him. For this moment, for this dependence, for this soft, claustrophobic trap disguised as love. And Diane realized the ghost had never left. It had simply changed its shape. She stared at the neatly arranged row of clothes, each one lined up with a precision she knew she'd never bothered with. Everything was perfect, too perfect. And for the first time, she couldn't trust her own memory. Had she done this? Or had someone slipped into her routine so quietly that she couldn't tell where her habits ended and their influence began? Little doubts began nibbling at her like tiny teeth. Maybe she had rinsed that cup and forgotten. Maybe she had shifted that bookmark without noticing. Maybe she had spent an hour reorganizing her closet while lost in thought. That's what Lawrence told her anyway. He'd cup her face gently and tell her she was burning herself out, that she wasn't sleeping well, that stress played tricks on the mind. His voice always soft, always patient. "You're worn out," he would say. "You're not thinking clearly." And she'd find herself wondering, was he right? If she couldn't rely on her own recollection, what could she rely on at all? Then the apartment itself began to turn strange. Her TV would flicker to life without warning, but not with the gentle dramas she loved. Instead, it blasted the kind of loud, brutal films that Lawrence watched, scenes of chaos and noise that made her flinch. Doors began to act like they had moods of their own. The bathroom door refused to let her out unless she shoved her shoulder into it. Her bedroom door creaked open the moment she turned off the light, and the front door, it stayed shut whenever Lawrence was around, but opened effortlessly when she was home alone. And the nights were the worst. There were whispers, faint, drifting sounds that could have been the wind, if the wind knew how to form almost words. Soft footsteps crossed the floorboards just beyond her line of sight, stopping the instant she turned her head. One night she woke to the sound of someone quietly sobbing in the kitchen, a fragile, broken kind of crying. But when she finally forced herself to look, the kitchen stood still and empty, its silence almost mocking. Piece by piece, a terrible understanding took shape. Someone else was there. Someone who had been there from the very beginning. The flowers that arrived at perfect moments. The lucky timing. The things that moved on their own, or were moved for her. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't clumsiness. This wasn't forgetfulness. This was interference. But from who and for what? Lawrence was always in her apartment now. His lease had expired months ago, and instead of finding a new place, he simply never left hers. His shirts hung beside hers. His razor sat beside her perfume. His presence clung to every corner of the home like thick, unmoving fog. Her days began to blur. She moved through work like a ghost. Her sister's calls became messages, then fewer messages, then nothing at all. Diane felt herself thinning out, dissolving into someone she didn't recognize, a pale version of her own life. Then came the night everything shifted. It was the middle of February, a little after 3 in the morning, when she jolted awake with no idea why. Lawrence wasn't beside her. She found him at the window, silhouetted against the glow of the streetlight. The way the light hit him made his shadow stretch impossibly far across the room. Too long, too sharp, too heavy to belong to one man. She whispered, "Can't sleep." He didn't move, didn't even breathe like she expected. "I've always liked this spot," he murmured at last. "She used to stand here too." Diane's skin tightened. She hadn't asked the question out loud. She hadn't spoken her name. But he said it anyway. She, someone she had never heard of. Someone who apparently once stood exactly where she was now. Says it when every syllable carries weight, when every sound is a warning. Diane froze, the room suddenly alive with shadows that weren't hers. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears as Lawrence stepped closer, calm, deliberate, almost hypnotic. "You don't understand," he murmured, voice low, smooth. She didn't listen, she never listened, and that's how things happen. Diane's hands shook, the newspaper trembling as if it knew the truth she was too afraid to face. She tried to speak, but her words stuck in her throat, lodged somewhere between fear and disbelief. Lawrence circled her slowly, each step measured, heavy. "I told you before," he whispered. "I've always been watching, always making sure things go the way they should." The lights in the apartment seemed to dim on their own, leaving her trapped in a cold, flickering glow. The air tasted metallic, thick with the scent of something old and lingering. Diane stumbled backward toward the bedroom door, only to find it locked. I'm leaving," she whispered, voice barely audible. Lawrence shook his head, almost pitying. "No, you're not. Not tonight, not when I'm here." His hand brushed the back of her shoulder. It was light, almost tender, but it carried the weight of inevitability. Diane's mind raced. The roses, the movies, the groceries. Every small thing had been a warning, a map of control she hadn't wanted to see until now. Julie Hartwell hadn't been a story in a newspaper. She had been a shadow on the walls, a ghost of someone who had stood where Diane now stood, watched, and ended. The whisper of Lawrence's voice filled the room again. "Accidents happen when people try to leave," he said softly, almost conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Especially when they think they can outsmart me." Diane's breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. Her life, once familiar, had become a stage where every action was under his scrutiny. Every attempt at normalcy a mistake. She backed against the wall, searching for some escape, some corner of reality that hadn't yet been claimed. But there was none. Not here, not tonight. Not while he stood there, calm, patient, and unshakably present. Her eyes darted to the clipping again, lying innocently on the table. The yellowed paper, the photograph of Julie at the window, proof that the past was alive in this apartment, that the history of someone else's terror had been folded into the very walls Diane now occupied. Lawrence's hand reached for hers, gentle yet controlling. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "You belong here with me, always." And in that moment, Diane realized the terrifying truth. She had never really been alone. She had never truly chosen. The apartment, the roses, the fleeting moments of luck, they had all been part of a story written long before she stepped through the door. And now she was trapped in it. The way he spoke her name, slow, clipped, almost scolding, froze her in place. It wasn't a lover calling out to someone he cared for. It was the tone someone uses when a pet has chewed through a shoe. A warning dressed as patience. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." That was all it took. Panic snapped through her and she bolted for the front door. She twisted the knob with both hands, yanking with every ounce of strength she had. But the door didn't so much as shiver. It didn't feel jammed. It felt unmoved, untouched, uninterested in her efforts, as if the wood had decided it was no longer a door at all, but part of the wall. Behind her, Lawrence's voice drifted through the air like smoke. "The building doesn't want you to go," he said softly. "It likes me here." Diane ran, not because she believed him, but because she was terrified that she did. She sprinted into the bedroom, grateful when the door swung open instantly, like a trap laid out just for her. She slammed it shut and locked it, leaning her weight against the wood as though her body alone might keep the world at bay. Her eyes darted to the window. 2 stories above the street. Cold air seeped through the glass as she wrenched it upward. It rose an inch, then slammed shut with a force that rattled the frame. She stumbled back, heart punching at her ribs. She tried again. Nothing. The window wouldn't even wiggle. Diane clawed at the glass, pounded on it, screaming into the night. Her fists thudded uselessly against the pane. Her cries dissolved into the empty street. No lights flicked on. No curtains shifted. No footsteps approached. And then behind her, the lock clicked. The bedroom door drifted open. Lawrence stood in the doorway, outlined by the dim glow from the hall. His shadow spilled across the floor, long and shapeless, as though it didn't belong to him at all. "You're frightened," he said gently. "It's a lot, I know. But once you calm down, you'll see things clearer. You always do." "Stay away from me," she whispered. "I wish I could," he replied, almost tender. "But we're meant for each other. Can't you feel that? This apartment brought us together. Every little moment, the flowers, the film, the groceries, it was all part of the plan." "Someone was trying to warn me," she said, voice shaking. He laughed softly. "You think she was trying to protect you, Julie? Sweetheart, no. She's still doing what she always did, helping me. She knows better than anyone how I need things, what I expect." Diane felt her stomach drop. The temperature in the room seemed to fall with it. Lawrence stretched out on the bed, asleep within minutes, as if nothing in the world was wrong, as if she were already his, already claimed, already done. But Diane didn't sleep. She sat curled in the corner, watching him breathe, thinking of the window that wouldn't open, the doors that chose their loyalties, the phone that slipped away whenever she reached for it. Every escape route twisted back toward him like a maze designed by a cruel mind. When dawn crept through the blinds, he rose, humming as he dressed. He kissed the top of her head, warm and casual, the way someone might greet a spouse of 20 years. "Have a good day," he said before leaving. "I'll see you tonight." The second he stepped outside, she lunged for the front door. It opened. Just opened. She stood in the doorway, her coat on, purse over her shoulder, keys trembling in her hand. The hallway smelled like dust and freedom. She could walk out. She could go to her sister. She could call the police. She could run and never look back. She took one step. Then she saw them. Roses everywhere. Not a handful, not a dozen, hundreds, maybe more. The floor looked carpeted in red petals. They blanketed the couch, the countertops, the stairs, the hallway behind her. They coated the apartment like a message spelled in flowers. Diane stepped into them slowly. They clung to her shoes, soft and damp, releasing a heavy perfume that turned her stomach, a scent that felt like morning. That's when the truth hit her all at once, cold enough to steal the air from her lungs. The spirit in that apartment had never been trying to protect her. It had never been guiding her toward escape. It had been smoothing his path, calming him, pleasing him, making sure his temper never reached a boiling point. Even in death, Julie was still doing everything she could to avoid angering him, still trying to keep him happy, still trapped. And now so was Diane. Diane could feel it now. Every decision she'd ever made, every quiet compromise, every flicker of doubt, it had all led to this. The apartment itself seemed to pulse around her, anticipating his needs, his moods, shaping her reality to keep him placid, unchallenged. And she realized with a sick clarity she had been the offering, another replacement, another victim. Julie's absence had not freed anyone. It had carved a space for Diane to step into. "No," Diane whispered into the hollow apartment. "No, I will not be yours. I will not be used, not like her, not like this." The roses shivered, not a single gust of wind, yet their petals trembled as if listening. "I will not be you. Do you hear me, Julie?" she demanded, voice rising. "I need help, not him, me." Silence, thick and suffocating, swallowed her words. Then slowly, impossibly, the roses began to stir. Petal by petal they shifted, forming a crimson trail stretching from the bedroom floor to the closet. Heart pounding, Diane followed, each step a test of courage, each inhale sharp as glass. The closet door yawned open before her. Behind coats and Lawrence's tailored suits, a section of the wall had shifted, a hidden seam of shadowed wood. She pressed against it. It gave way. A panel, long forgotten, revealed a narrow hollow. Inside was a time capsule of terror. Brittle papers, envelopes yellowed with age and old cracked foam, photographs frozen in sinister clarity. Pictures of Julie with Lawrence, smiling for the camera, hiding bruises no one else had noticed. Julie alone, face pale and silent, joy masked by fear. Drafted letters never sent, restraining order forms never filed. A diary chronicling every step of his tightening grip. The subtle manipulations, the veiled threats, the moments of violence escalating into obsession. And there it was, the final night before Julie's fall. A voice on the recording, Lawrence's voice, calling, "Diane, I forgot my phone. Are you home?" The door had opened then, just as it had for Diane, just as it had trapped her now. Hands trembling, Diane swept the papers into her bag, shoved the old phone into her coat pocket. The panel wouldn't close all the way. She covered it with coats and stepped back, breathing shallow. Lawrence appeared in the doorway like he always did, imposing, calm, terrifying. "What were you doing?" His tone was light, casual. "Nothing," Diane lied. "Just looking for my scarf." "In my side of the closet?" he asked, eyes narrowing slightly, studying her. She held up a scarf from the floor, pretending. "Yes, found it." He smiled then, a predator masking itself in charm. "Good. Wouldn't want you snooping where you shouldn't. Curiosity can be dangerous." He retrieved his phone from the nightstand and left the room as effortlessly as if nothing had happened. Diane exhaled, counting silently to 100 before daring to move. Then she seized her bag and bolted. The streets of Capitol Hill were quiet, nearly empty in the late winter light. She ran until the buildings thinned and the world felt like it had expanded again, until she reached the police station. A stately old structure, once a school or library, its doors promising authority, safety, intervention. Inside, she stepped over the threshold, her heartbeat loud in her ears, carrying with her the evidence of a nightmare that had been waiting, hidden for decades. The fight for freedom had only just begun. Diane sat beneath the hum of cold, fluorescent lights, her hands trembling as she pushed a bundle of evidence across the metal table. The man across from her, an officer with weary eyes and the stiff posture of someone who'd heard too many unbelievable stories, glanced at the pile without leaning in. "There," she said, "that's everything. Old photographs, faded letters, a shattered phone full of messages someone tried to make disappear, and a journal filled with fear pressed into every line." The detective flipped through the pages, with the bored precision of flipping a newspaper. "This is from 5 years ago," he murmured. "She never left," Diane whispered. "Not really. What happened then is still happening now." The man sighed, the kind of sigh that said he'd already decided what box to put her in. "We combed through this case back then. There was nothing pointing to foul play. All I see is a woman trying and failing to break off a toxic relationship." "She wrote everything," Diane said, leaning forward. "It's all right there. She said he chased her, cornered her, hurt her." "Can you prove any of that?" His voice softened, but not with compassion, with doubt. Diane swallowed hard. No, she couldn't prove it. All she had was Julie's terror trapped in ink. Julie's final message cut off mid-thought. Julie's last sentence, "He's here. He's furious. I'm leaving now." The detective closed the diary like it was nothing more than a romance novel. "If he's threatening you, we can help. We can get a protective order." "That didn't save her," Diane snapped. "She never filed because she knew he'd kill her for it." He paused, something like pity flickering in his eyes. And in that moment, Diane knew the truth. The system that failed Julie would fail her too. Julie had understood that before she died. Documentation wasn't the same as protection. A plea wasn't the same as rescue. Being right wasn't the same as being believed. Diane walked out without looking back. She went straight to her sister's house and poured out the entire nightmare in one breathless confession. Her sister listened quietly, jaw tight, eyes glistening. "You're not going back there," she said when Diane finished. "Tonight, we're leaving tonight." "He'll follow me," Diane whispered. "And we'll handle that when he does," her sister replied. "But you can't spend another minute in that place. The apartment, it won't let me leave. Not when he's around." Then we go while he's gone." They drove together, her sister's presence steadying her trembling hands. The apartment door swung open without a fight, as if pretending it had never held her captive at all. Diane packed at lightning speed, clothes, documents, her laptop, anything she couldn't bear to lose. But the whole time she felt eyes on her, a chill in the corners, the faintest pressure at her back like someone breathing a warning she couldn't quite hear. She was zipping her suitcase when it happened. Heavy footsteps, slow, purposeful, coming up the stairs. Her sister's eyes widened. "We have to move now." They lunged for the front door. Diane grabbed the knob and pulled. Nothing. It didn't budge. "Diane." His voice seeped through the crack under the door. Calm, too calm. "I know you're inside. Open up." Her sister rammed her shoulder into the door frame until the wood rattled, but it was useless. The door felt fused to the wall. "Window," Diane breathed. "The window, try the window." They sprinted to the living room. Her sister shoved it upward. And for the first time since Diane moved in, it opened. The window flung open with a blast of winter air sharp enough to sting her skin. Diane leaned out, staring at the two-story drop beneath her. The wind whipped at her hair as a terrifying thought crept in. This is how Julie fell. This is how I disappear too. Her sister grabbed her arm. The fire escape there. Diane blinked. There was no fire escape. She checked 100 times, but as her sister pointed, something impossible happened. Metal stairs, rusted, crooked, older than the building itself, folded into existence against the brick, as if the night itself had shaped them out of shadow. They shouldn't have been real. But there they were. Diane whispered, barely audible, "Thank you, Julie." Behind them, the front door exploded inward. Lawrence wasn't using keys anymore. He was tearing the place apart with raw fury. She could hear him on the other side of the room, heavy breathing, the kind that told you exactly how much he enjoyed the fear he caused. Diane swung her leg out the window first. The metal groaned under her weight, creaking like something awakened from a long sleep. But it held. Her sister followed, and they clattered down step after trembling step, gripping the cold rails until their hands ached. Only when Diane's shoes hit the pavement did she dare turn around. Up in the window, framed by the dim apartment light, Lawrence stood towering and monstrous, and just to his right, blocking him, holding him back, was the faintest suggestion of another shape. A woman's outline, dim and wavering like smoke, but unmistakably there. Julie, still protecting, still fighting. "Come on," her sister urged, pulling her toward the car. Diane didn't look back again. 3 weeks later, police finally hauled Lawrence away. Not for what he did to Julie. They still insisted there was no proof for that, but for breaking into Diane's old apartment, for stalking her, for ignoring the restraining order she'd filed the moment she was safe. It wasn't justice, not really, but it was a beginning. As investigators dug deeper, pieces of the truth began to surface, dark, ugly pieces that had been buried for years. Julie's deleted messages were recovered, message after message showing threats, manipulation, the escalating cruelty he worked so hard to hide. Neighbors recalled nights of shouting from her apartment, but had been too afraid to intervene. His fingerprints turned up where they never should have been. Security logs showed him entering Julie's building long after their breakup. Detectives whispered that they were slowly putting together a case, maybe too slowly, but this time the story wasn't fading into silence. Meanwhile, Diane tried to rebuild. She slept in her sister's guest room. She sat through therapy sessions she could barely speak in. She changed her number. She avoided Capitol Hill entirely. And yet on quiet nights with the lights off and the world still, her thoughts always drifted to Julie. Was she free now? Was she at peace? Or did the dead carry their nightmares with them? One cold night in March, Diane's phone buzzed with a number she didn't recognize. Her thumb hovered over the screen before she finally picked up. Hello. Silence. Not the empty kind. The kind filled with someone breathing, listening, waiting. Diane's voice cracked. Julie. More breathing, steady, soft, present. She held the phone to her ear like it was something alive, her heart pounding, her eyes burning. Are you okay? She whispered. And then just before the call ended, Diane heard the faintest exhale, warm and grateful, like someone saying goodbye after finally being heard. The line went dead. The whisper lingered in her ears for a heartbeat longer than it should have. Thank you, it said, so faint Diane thought it might be a trick of her mind. And then the line went dead. That was the last time she heard Julie's voice. The trial came the following October, almost exactly a year after Diane had first moved into that apartment. Lawrence wasn't convicted of murder. They could never pull enough evidence from the shadows of the past to prove it. But for assault, harassment, stalking, he got 6 years. 6 years to remind him that someone somewhere had finally drawn a line. It wasn't perfect justice. Nothing about it could ever bring back what Julie had lost. But it was time. Time for Diane to breathe. Time for whatever fragments of Julie remained to finally rest. The apartment on the second floor stood empty again. The landlord mentioned renovations, knocking down walls, opening spaces, maybe erasing the echoes of years gone wrong. Diane imagined that room breathing freely again, stripped of its heavy air, its lingering scent of roses and fear. She never went back to see if it had changed. Some places, once you escape, you never return to. Some doors, once closed, should never be reopened. For 6 months, she stayed with her sister, a small island of safety, before finding a modest house on the far side of the city. She learned to navigate life cautiously now, testing boundaries, listening to her instincts with a patience she had never known. She learned the subtle language of danger, the concern that demanded obedience, the affection tied to control, the kind of love that came with conditions. She learned to say no, to walk away, to trust the cold, sharp warning in her gut that whispered, "This is not safe." Even in the quiet of her new home, in the empty closets and the unfamiliar night sounds, she thought of Julie, standing in that window, watching, warning, waiting. Julie who had died trying to escape. Julie who had fought with all the strength she had left, even when it meant bending her morality, twisting herself to survive. Diane finally understood. Trauma could distort the right and the wrong. Survival could force impossible choices. Even in death, some people were chained to the patterns carved into them by fear and violence. She hoped Julie had found peace. Hoped she had finally let go of trying to shield him. Hoped she had stopped sacrificing others to soften his wrath. But she could not know. Some mysteries stayed buried. Some ghosts kept their secrets. Diane lived. She rebuilt slowly, fiercely, carefully. She watched, she listened, she honored herself. And in the end, that was all anyone could do. Live, learn, and hope that when the time came, nothing remained to haunt. No unfinished business. No rage that lingered beyond the grave. She survived. She thrived. And that her life was the only vengeance that truly mattered. It arrived quietly, without warning, on a chilly November Tuesday. An envelope that had traveled across months, bouncing through old forwarding addresses before landing in her hands. Diane almost tossed it into the trash. The envelope was aged, yellowed, the ink of the address looping in delicate, almost forgotten script, the kind that seemed to belong to another century. But something inside her stirred. She slid it open, and a single sheet of paper slipped free. Its edges were browned with time, the handwriting precise, deliberate, the kind that spoke of someone who had been taught to write properly, long before cursive had fallen out of fashion. The letter began. To whoever finds this, if you are reading it, I am likely gone. He always said I was dramatic, that I imagined horrors that didn't exist, that I saw shadows where there were none. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps I am crazy. But I must leave this here, hidden where he will never see it, because someone needs to know. Someone must know what happened here, in case I do not survive to tell it myself. Julie's words painted the horror clearly. Lawrence Trent, 3B 8 months together before he started appearing every night, before he had the key, before Julie realized there was no escape. He hadn't struck her, she clarified, but there were other ways to wound a person, to seize their life without leaving a mark. Doors that wouldn't open, phones that vanished, stairs that became barriers, a building that seemed to conspire with him, bending reality itself to trap her. Every attempt to leave ended in failure. Stuck doors, dead car batteries, disappearing phones, as if the walls themselves were his accomplices. I am going to try one more time, she wrote. Tonight I've packed. My sister waits 2 blocks away at midnight. I only have to get down the stairs and out the door. If you are reading this, I didn't make it. Please, please don't let him do this to anyone else. Don't let the building claim another victim. October 17th, 2019. Julie Hartwell. Diane folded the letter slowly, her hands trembling, and returned it to its envelope as if touching it too roughly might erase the weight of the words. She drove through the foggy streets to the police station. The same gray walls, the same harsh fluorescent lights. She asked for the detective who had taken her statement, only to be told he was in a meeting. She waited, heart hammering, the letter clutched like a lifeline. Minutes stretched into hours, each one dragging her further into the memory of that apartment, the stairs, the locked doors, the whispers of someone trapped between fear and faith. When he finally emerged, Diane stood, hands shaking, ready to hand over the proof that someone else had almost vanished, just like she had. The letter, the diary, the photos, all of it. She needed him to see, to understand, to act before history repeated itself. Because some ghosts did not rest, and some buildings remember. And Diane knew now. The only way to stop them was to make sure their story was never forgotten. He stepped out of the conference room, and the moment his eyes met hers, something in his expression softened, like he'd been waiting for this confrontation long before either of them knew it would happen. Diane didn't waste a second. I brought something you need to see, she said quietly, placing the weathered envelope in his hand. The detective unfolded the letter right there in the lobby. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead as his eyes moved steadily across the page. He didn't react, not with surprise, not with disbelief. When he finally looked up, his voice was low. Where did you get this? In the wall of the apartment, she answered. I went back. She hadn't. She couldn't have. The truth was simpler and more painful. The landlord had found it during demolition and hunted her down. Convinced she should know what had been hidden there. Convinced it meant something. The detective exhaled slowly. This isn't evidence, he said. But the doubt from their first meeting was gone. His words came softer, as if he were trying to protect her from the disappointment he expected. It shows she knew she wasn't safe, Diane said. It shows she understood what was happening. It shows she feared him, he replied. We were aware of that part. It shows the building helped him. His gaze sharpened, not skeptical, searching. You've been in that place, he murmured. You felt it, didn't you? He didn't wait for her to answer. His voice dropped to a tone that carried the weight of old stories and older truths. My grandmother used to say this city has bones, and some buildings remember everything they've buried. He paused. Some places take in the pain, and sometimes they want more. Diane felt a chill rise along her arms. Do you believe that? I believe, he said carefully, that certain men know how to twist fear into a weapon, and if a woman already senses something wrong in her home, they know how to use that too. He folded the letter, slid it into his pocket with deliberate care. I'll include this in the file. Maybe it'll matter when his parole comes up, maybe not. And the building. Being gutted, new walls, fresh paint, new people soon. He shrugged like a man who'd seen too much to make promises. Could fix things, could make it worse. Hard to say. She accepted that. She hadn't come for reassurance. Diane drove back to her small house far across the river. The house where doors opened when she turned the knob, where windows glided up without resistance, where the air didn't feel like it had eyes. Inside, she brewed a cup of tea and sat alone at her kitchen table. The quiet felt honest in a way she hadn't realized she'd been missing. Her mind kept returning to Julie, a woman who had fought for freedom even after death, a woman who had tried to live by giving the monster what he wanted, because terror had rewritten her instincts until survival felt like sacrifice. It was horrifying and heartbreakingly human. Diane wondered if forgiveness applied to someone who had suffered that deeply. If trauma could blur the lines between victim and accomplice, if desperation could justify the unthinkable. No answers came, only the steady ticking of a clock and the soft warmth of the tea mug in her hands. What she did know, what she felt with absolute clarity, was this. She was alive. She had walked away from a place that devoured people quietly, and she would carry the memory of that escape for the rest of her life, a reminder of how thin the line had been, and how easily she could have become another name sealed inside a wall. Diane learned to move through life with intention, noticing the small warnings she might once have ignored. She trusted her instincts, left situations that felt wrong, and no longer rationalized the signs of danger. The doors that jammed, the phones that disappeared, the gnawing certainty that something was off. And sometimes when the house was still and her thoughts drifted to shadows, she whispered to herself, I'm sorry, Julie. I'm sorry you were alone. I'm sorry you did what you had to do, but I survived. Maybe that matters. Maybe it's enough. Outside, the November wind rustled through leafless branches. Inside, Diane sipped her tea, surrounded only by the life she had built. Doors swung freely, windows welcomed light, and nothing watched her as she slept. She was free. Far away in Capitol Hill, an apartment on the second floor of a Victorian building stood empty, freshly painted and hollowed of its past. Walls had been knocked down, floors refinished, fixtures replaced, the traces of roses erased, the stubborn doors repaired. The space waited silently, ready for a new life to fill it. Yet some things cannot be scrubbed away. Some memories linger in the bones of a building, in the air that moves through its rooms. On quiet nights when the street outside is empty and the apartment seems still, you might sense it. A presence, a coldness, a quiet watching. Or perhaps you feel nothing at all. Perhaps it depends on who you are, what you carry, what the building wants from you. Perhaps the apartment rests now, having been broken by Julie's final act, the impossible stairs, the open window, a rebellion that defied the monster it had sheltered. Perhaps Julie's spirit finally chose a path of its own, or perhaps not. Perhaps the cycle waits, patient as only old buildings can be, knowing there will always be another tenant, another man who wields fear, another woman who needs a place to live. Perhaps the next resident will notice the pattern before it closes in, clever enough to escape what others could not, or perhaps they will not. The apartment remains, as apartments always do, neutral, patient, waiting to be shaped by whoever walks through its doors. Just walls, floors, and windows. Just a place to live. Nothing more, nothing less.